Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to talk about the first two episodes of Wandavision. So, reasonably, these episodes are really just, hey guys, do you love nostalgia? Do ya? Well, that's all you're gonna get out of these shows. You're just gonna get nostalgia of Dick Van Dyke or Bewitched. Reasonably, you're just going to kind of just get a little tiny hint of what's going on, but ultimately I'm assuming that we're not going to get any lick of real actual like what is actually going on until the very end of this season, which ultimately I will probably be annoyed by that point, to be brutally honest. Ultimately, when watching this show, I ultimately am just like, well, I don't need to otherwise see a I Love Lucy, Dick Van Dyke, Bewitched kind of show. I could have already gone into any other platform to watch those. And so immediately when I kind of see how this show is like going into a very Leave It to Beaver kind of way, I'm like, dude, I can watch any number of these shows before I could have came to watch this. I don't need to watch this kind of show to watch something that I've already seen at some point in time. Uh, what is the point of this show? And the point of it is like, hey guys, little tiny Easter eggs that ultimately you'll see here that ultimately remind you of so and so characters, which I won't get into until I get into spoilers. So when going into this, I was honestly just kind of bored, to be brutally honest. A lot of the dialogue was just like, God, I could probably mostly watch this show on mute and it would be fine. I don't need to care about any of the dialogue because if anything, most of the time, the two main actors, which is Wanda and Vision, are just playing characters that are consistently confused about what is going on in their environment, and that's pretty much it. There isn't much to really go into and decipher much more than that. Really, a lot of the episodes are any kind of cliche ish episode that you've ever seen in your life of a black and white episode. Um, but eventually are supposedly going to eventually just and give us kind of per episode kind of much more like a evolution of TV, which honestly I'm just like, oh great, so again we're just gonna kind of keep playing up this whole thing and eventually we'll again get answers by the very tail end of this season. So ultimately, just hey everybody, just wait till this show just comes out and just skip to the end, skip to the very last episode, and because it won't matter, because you're not going to get anything to the very end of all of this. Is kind of how I feel, and I don't know. I think people could just like the fact that there's just another Marvel thing out there. I just immediately thinking, I'm like, well, if they would have probably had this show going on while Mandalorian was going on, I think I would have been I think I would have been fine with this. Uh, I think delaying it kind of hurt it in the end, to have it just being delayed. Because I'm like, okay, so this show isn't good enough for me on its own, which is which is sad to say. It's not good on its own. Like it's not worth buying a Disney subscription, a Disney Plus subscription to watch alone. Hence why, justifiably, I think they should have had this while Mandalorian was going on to get people kind of to adjust to this show while watching a show that everybody wanted to see. Ultimately, I think a lot of people are probably going to do just what I said, probably just wait to the end and just get all the answers. If anything, there are some interesting characters that I am kind of more and more like ultimately kind of picking out as like, oh, okay, this is the person that ultimately is going to be important somewhere down the road. And I think this person is the villain, and I think this person is this, and blah, 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 blah. So, anyways, I think at the end of the day, let's ultimately just go into spoilers. There's not much to even talk about reasonably in here because a lot of the dialogue and a lot of the story, like, I guess, like, you can ultimately call this show, like, almost like a Pleasantville, or, like, it has, I guess, what you would call in old fashioned terms, I guess, a whimsy to it, I guess. If you want to say it's like that, it's like, it kind of brings you back to a simpler time, and it kind of has those fun little tropes to it. But and funny enough, me talking about Pleasantville ultimately is a Tobey Maguire film. Um, Interestingly enough, Pleasantville vibes maybe. Um, but anyways, so I think it's about that time to go into Double Five. There's nothing to really talk about in the there's like this show feels like nothing to me to be brutally honest. There's little hisps and clues and stuff like that, and like that could be interesting, but I'm just like I don't really like I felt like this was like Agent Carter to me. I'm like I don't need to watch this show to ultimately understand anything about Wanda, Vision, or anybody else who's in part of the show. And when ultimately they eventually do a movie with these characters, I'm like, oh, okay, well, I didn't need to see WandaVision to understand what is going on with the MCU. So I guess that's great. So, in other words, like any of these shows, because this show is kind of telling you this, that basically any of these shows won't matter at all to eventually what is a Marvel movie. You can just watch this and enjoy it for what it is, and then once you get to a Marvel movie, then it won't matter. There's no tie. So I'm like, oh, okay, great. That's easy. That's great for me. So let's get into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil. Whew, this show. So within these two episodes, let's at first talk about the spoiler things because that's the only real thing that's actually important. So, really, the spoilers to me is the consistent logo of Agents of Sword. So, I'm like, well, so this show is just to set up another show because they're doing an Agents of Sword show. So, am I to believe that reasonably what they're going to do is they're going to piggyback off of this show to try and support another show that is coming up that ultimately people like, hey, get ready for Agents of Sword because ultimately the tail end of Agents of Sword or the tail end of WandaVision is going to be the beginning of Agents of Sword. Why should I care? So this is just like, hey guys, you're just gonna really be excited about another show, not this one. You're just gonna be excited about another show that we're gonna do, because knowing full well, I know that there's certain characters that are going to be on Agents of Sword that are going to be familiar with WandaVision, because X-Men and mutants and stuff like that, which ultimately will be on this show. Uh, Ultimately, I'm assessing already that reasonably Agnes is ultimately going to be the villain of the show because ultimately you have it to where Agnes is actually the best friend of Wanda. So I'm like, well, clearly it's not actually going to be there. They've already built up a person that seems to be the villain of this show, or the person that we shouldn't like. And ultimately everyone's going to assess that, oh well, she's probably the villain, right? No, it's going to be Wanda's best friend. So that way it's basically like, when having it, it's like, assess that the best friend is going to ultimately be their worst enemy, kind of thing. That's what happens to Smallville, aka Superman. Freaking like, that's what happens in Smallville. It's like Lex eventually becomes the villain of Clark. So they're kind of doing the same thing. They're giving people the illusion that, oh yeah, this person is friendly to them. They're going to help them. And so what we have here is, we have a very black and white show. We ultimately have it to where seemingly Vision and Wanda are seemingly almost newlyweds that don't even have wedding rings. And they are going into this town and driving on into this town to ultimately have Vision uh, be working in some business that has no real rational reason for him to be even working in this business, because he ultimately tries to figure out what the actual business does. And ultimately it's like, well, what do we do? Do we sell anything? Do we buy anything? Like, what do we actually do in this business? And ultimately nobody really can tell him that. They just said, well, if anything, sales have just been up 300% since you got here. It's like, well, yeah, but what did they do? There is no answer. And we ultimately have plenty of times where ultimately we have Vision and Wanda that are trying to come up with these answers, and they have no clue, like, what their past is. They have no clue uh, that they know that they're tied to one another, but they don't know when they had gotten married. They don't know much of anything of like anniversaries or anything like that. It seems that Vision knows that there is a important day on the calendar because there's a heart to it, but heaven forbid they actually know what that means. And eventually they find out that the heart is just that. Eventually their boss, who is named Hart or something like that, let me try to figure this out here. Yeah, Mr. and Mrs. Hart ultimately are uh, to come to dinner on that day. And so reasonably we have it to where Wanda is ultimately trying to make dinner, and ultimately doing a very horrible job at it, which ultimately is to just kind of placate to, like, oh, a girl with magic, oh, she has to like mess it all up, and ultimately just uh, make some goofy issues where it's like, instead of a turkey, it's eggs, or instead of lobsters, the lobster goes flying out of the room. And so yeah, it's like, I would call it whimsy. Like, I would ultimately, like, there's some portion of this where I can ultimately at some points just kind of find of like cute or fun or whatever. I ultimately enjoyed. I actually got an actual laugh when ultimately Vision ultimately ran back into his bed and put up his covers in front of his face and was like, like, when ultimately the branch on the tree ultimately was clacking against the window. I thought that that moment was actually funny. But recently, a lot of this show, I just thought it was like, yeah, I'm like, I can't get interested in this show. I can't. And ultimately, it's kind of intriguing to, like, I'm wondering if this show is ultimately going to get longer, considering they're going to try to keep a certain time period per every episode. And so I'm wondering if we're just going to have like 30-minute blocks for the first two episodes, but then eventually, once we start to get into more like out of the Technicolor and the more like high def, whatever looking show, that ultimately we're going to have like a 1 hour episode, or something along those lines. And it's just like, it's kind of showing the evolution of TV, how the episodes will tend to get longer and stuff along those lines. Um, but anyways, so in this first episode, we have it to where the Hearts are coming to dinner, and recently at one point there's a lot of gags about ultimately Vision being who he is. Kind of gags about that, like, oh, I married a real man kind of thing, and all like, like he's not a robot or anything. Like, no, he's real. He's a real man. Like, I'm like, what are all these jokes? I guess I'm just like, I guess that's just the old fashioned way of just like, well, we have nothing else to say, so let's say these like puns or whatever that is supposed to just foreshadow what is to actually be going on or whatever. So we have it in here that really in this episode, we eventually have it to where the Hearts and Wanda and Vision eventually sit down for breakfast, because ultimately, evidently, that's the only thing that Wanda can actually make. So it's just like, hey, let's just have breakfast for dinner. And ultimately, we have it to where, like, Vision is ultimately saying, it's like, well, my wife is very European. It's like, give her a break. So they're like, okay, all right, we'll have breakfast for dinner. So ultimately they eat breakfast for dinner, and ultimately we have Mr. and Mrs. Hart. We ultimately have like Mr. Hart that is ultimately starting to ask them questions, and ultimately those questions just lead to Wanda and Vision not having any answers to a lot of things. To where ultimately, eventually, we have it to where Mr. Hart eventually is choking on something, and they're just watching him basically choke. I'm like, okay, like, do they not realize that they should be giving him the Heimlich or try to like smack it out of him or whatever? Like, they're just kind of like watching him die, and plus there was a really interesting moment that um that I saw about this show, especially when they do the little rewind thing. I'm like, well, was that one thing that ultimately like Wanda didn't want to see? So ultimately uh she rewound the tape on purpose to go back to where she was, so that way she could hide something that she didn't want to see, because a beekeeper coming out of a sewer makes no sense. And so in Scarlet Witch's mind, ultimately, since that didn't make sense, ultimately we have it to where Wanda had to rewind to rewind her uh, thing going on here to cut out that inaccuracy or that inability or that wrong image in a wrong place. Because I'm wondering as we go along in these episodes whether there's going to be some stuff that is going to be put in that makes no sense, and Wanda is going to have to keep rewinding it and cutting these things out that ultimately is not wrong in her brain. Um, is I what I thought was going on. So, but anyways, we have a tour ultimately. They finally eventually smack it out of the Mr. Hart and ultimately save him from choking, and that is really just like the bulk of this episode was just that reasonably like people going into their jobs, and ultimately Wanda going into cooking things and not really knowing what a hill of beans to do. That is really and rationally what all happened in this first episode was just, hey, yeah, coming to dinner, boss coming to dinner, and ultimately, uh, it seemed that ultimately Vision is better at his job than anyone else is, but we couldn't really explain what Vision is actually doing for his job. But anyways, so we move on to the next episode, and I found kind of the next episode kind of like a little bit funnier, like the episode again where uh they're kind of hearing, or I guess towards the tail end of the first episode, the whole like bedroom thing, where ultimately go into, well I guess the second one, the second episode, because I think the first episode just ends with them like having this great date, and the ultimately just kind of do the clicker and end the episode. Uh, the second episode I think gets a little bit more bizarre, because really towards the tail end of the episode, I really just don't quite understand. So in the beginning of this episode, we have to eventually Wanda and Vision are hearing a clatter or commotion, and ultimately it is some branch that is hitting their window. But I find it hilarious how like cowardly they are, or just how funny they act. To this sound. So ultimately, we have it to where eventually Wanda eventually takes care of this sound, and ultimately it pushes their bed together, and ultimately they tend to do some bedroom business, I guess. So I liked this moment. I thought that this moment was really fun. I thought it was interesting. To just kind of just go into this and just go like, okay, this is kind of a nice moment. Like this is kind of, there's some fun going on. Uh, but then really we have it to where ultimately this second episode goes into ultimately having Vision having to perform a magic trick, ultimately being a magician, and ultimately like, well, wouldn't have Wanda been the magician? But I guess it's like, well, like looking at it, the old fashioned roles, you have to have the magician be a male and blah blah blah, and so reasonably, either one of these characters uh, could be a magician of sorts, because Vision is quasi magical at some point. But like the first episode, we have like this Dick Van Dyke kind of thing going on, where it seems like there's a lot of tropes there, where it seems that Vision almost trips on this one chair, where and ultimately I feel like the intro uh to that was similar to Dick Van Dyke. The second episode we have very much very similar Bewitched theme that ultimately goes into like the logos and stuff like that, and it looks very familiar to Bewitched. I remember that both of these shows. Uh, like quasi, like I think I've seen more Bewitched than I have seen of Dick Van Dyke, but it ends up being what it is. So, in this episode, we ultimately have it to where it seems that Vision is talking with his coworkers, and there's a lot of laugh track going on within this thing, and I'm like, man, they're really pulling out that laugh track a lot. But when looking at it, it's like everything I guess has to be funny, so they have to overly use the laugh track, and I guess it's gonna get to a point where eventually the laugh track will be probably non-existent, because eventually we'll get into other shows eventually. So we have it to where going on into this episode, we have it to where we have Vision who's ultimately talking to his cohorts, and one of his cohorts ultimately gives him a stick of Big Red, and ultimately Vision ultimately starts chewing on it, but eventually someone smacks him in the back to ultimately the piece of gum goes down his mouth. And so all of a sudden we are starting to realize that Vision could quite possibly have been defeated by a stick of gum. A stick of gum, I mean. Um, like, wow, how a simple thing like gum could ultimately really just take down Vision. Like, man, if only Ultron would have came with that consensus. Just give him some gum. Just give him some gum, you kill him off. who needs kryptonite or any kind of weird eccentric weaponry? All you need is a stick of gum, and you could just kill this guy. Wouldn't it be crazy, man? If you could just put like a if you could just put like an explosive of sorts, or some kind of or not explosive, some kind of like super glue, and you just pour it into Vision, he'd be dead. I guess. So we ultimately have it to our Vision after getting a thing of chewing gum, where we have to consistently see the progress of this chewing gum going through Vision circuits. We are consistently seeing it mucking up the works. To ultimately, we're kind of seeing Vision drunk. So ultimately, don't give this guy a beer, just give him a piece of gum, and he's drunk. So we have it to her ultimately in this second episode. It seems that Monica Rambeau, or Geraldine, is ultimately in this episode, and it seems like she's having a prominent role in this episode. Ultimately, I think Monica Rambeau could quite possibly be Miss Marvel or Spectrum, and ultimately, I'm like, well, it seems that when Wanda is talking to Monica, it seems that Monica doesn't know. It seems that Monica doesn't know much else like Wanda does. So I'm like, oh, okay. So she's another hero that's also stuck in this whole thing, and like she's having to play along, just like Wanda is. Because I think that Vision isn't actually a real boy. I think Vision is just something that Wanda had thought up, and because ultimately she loves him. So within these episodes, we kind of get some Easter eggs. Ultimately, we get at the tail end of the first episode, we get to see that there is a sword agent that is clicking on dials and hitting buttons and whichever. It also seems that we also got a Stark toaster that ultimately is showcased on the first episode to, I guess, ultimately tell us that there is some tying to Stark in here. In the second episode, we have a Strucker watch, which ultimately I'm like, well, is this tied to Baron von Strucker? Is ultimately, are we gonna go back into talking about Hydra at some point at the end of this show, or is that to just remind Wanda about her being with Baron von Strucker? Um, and ultimately, because I was thinking, I'm like, wait a minute, is that Schmidt? Is that a Schmidt watch or is it a Strucker watch? I'm like, okay, wait, it's a Strucker watch. Because ultimately, I was thinking, I'm like, what does this have some tied Red Skull or something like that on here? But ultimately, I'm like, no, this is Strucker. This is the guy that held uh, Wanda captive. Also, it seems that when they are all kind of doing this woman's meeting to ultimately talk about the activities that ultimately they're going to get into, we ultimately have a girl that is ultimately Dottie, that is from who I know had been on the show Buffy, as being Xander's wife, and ultimately I'm like, oh yeah, I'm familiar with this person. Like I've seen her before in Buffy, and so I've kind of seen her in kind of a cluster of other things, but anyways, um, ultimately, I think she is kind of played to be like, oh, she's gonna be the villain in here, and I'm like, no, she's not. I'm like, I don't think she is. Like, uh, I think she is probably the person that you were to probably assume is going to be the villain, but that's not going to be it at all. I think Agnes is going to be the villain. Uh, so we ultimately probably like I'm thinking that these characters that ultimately are in Wanda's mind will probably have a more prominent role somewhere down the road. Because I think at some point it's going to be like Wizard of Oz, where eventually Wanda is going to wake up from all of this, and it's going to end up being that, oh, like um well, hey, like you were the Tin Man, and you were the Scarecrow, and you were the Lion, and so on and so forth. You were all the people that were in my dream, and I think that's how it's all going to end up. Is like these people will have more significant roles somewhere down the road, but it won't be till the very tail end of all this, because why wouldn't they? So we have it to where more than likely they're probably all going to be either sword agents or whatever, because again, sword. So we have it in here to where ultimately Vision is at first in the very beginning of this episode trying to test out this trick, but we ultimately have Wanda who ultimately ruins the trick, and then ultimately we have it to where eventually we have Vision who is going to ruin all these tricks by being this quote unquote drunk ish like Vision. So we have it to ultimately Vision ultimately is doing all these tricks that can't actually be explained. So Wanda has to use her magical powers to ultimately get them all to be explained. As well as in the first episode, they didn't have wedding rings on their hands, so ultimately Wanda had to create said wedding rings to justify that this couple is a married couple. Um, because ultimately they cement that I guess that they are married, but there isn't really any justification if they are or not. I guess that's just the reasonable assumption that if they live together, I guess they must be married. I guess the old fashioned assumption. But anyways, in the second episode, we have it to where ultimately Vision is flying, and ultimately we have to have it to where uh, Wanda is going to create a pulley system to make it look like he is kind of jockeying up and down on a string. We ultimately have it to where Vision is ultimately going to pick up a piano, and ultimately we have it to where Wanda is ultimately going to pick up that same piano and make it look like it's a cardboard cutout of that same piano. And we ultimately have it to where Vision is ultimately going to do the trick that was ultimately seen earlier, and ultimately have it to where we have Monica appear out of that box and to surprise everybody. So we eventually have it towards the tail end of this episode that we have it to where that Wanda and Vision ultimately get this award for the best comedy act out of everybody. I'm like, well, Wanda and Vision were the only people that went up there. So I guess it's like, well, yeah, here's your award for doing jack crap nothing, just being here because nobody else went against you. So, like, this is the only comedy act we saw. So, hey, here's an award for what you did. Uh, but yeah, I think that was really much all of really what to actually say about these episodes. Reasonably, the only real Easter egg that happened in this episode was the little helicopter that had the sword emblem on it that was gold and those gold and red. I'm like, well, so is Agent of Sword a Stark Initiative thing, or is it just the fact that reasonably uh, they don't have any real cementing colors for sword yet, so reasonably they're just going with gold and red, just to ultimately not reveal what color that sword will actually be. I'm kind of interested because from what I remember about sword, I remember them mostly being like green and blue or green and black or something like that. Like so, ultimately, I'm kind of wondering if like what does the red and gold and the Stark thing symbolize? Is that ultimately is Stark back as Iron Man as a digital entity? Was there always a plan for Stark to come back as Iron Man as a again a just a head entity like we've kind of seen in some other kind of comic books and stuff like that? Uh, when looking at it, people are consistently mentioning that, well, hey, I think that Chris Evans is going to come back as Captain America, and I think that he's going to come back. I think it's going to happen. And ultimately, we have it to where Chris Evans is mentioning that it's like, well, hey, any of the stuff that is coming out that ultimately saying that I'm going to come back as Captain America is news to me, which ultimately means that it's like, yeah, you're probably going to come back at some point, but not right now. Probably just take like a bit of time off. And then eventually just have some little teaser of him coming back, and everybody's going like, "Whoa!" and everybody's going to go crazy about it. Or ultimately, if he were to come back, reasonably, it's not like he's going to say anything, as well as Tony or ultimately Robert Downey Jr. is not going to say anything either. But it's not like they're not going to want to like, oh well, hey, like, well, I really want to have some of that sweet, delicious Marvel money. It's not like they're going to turn that down. So, anyways, going on into here, yeah, it's just kind of it feels like old fashioned like whimsy and stuff like that. Like to me, it's just like there's not much here beyond Easter eggs and little tiny things that ultimately is going to make me think of what could possibly happen more. I'm honestly like thinking probably that this show has a lot more in it than I'm like fully fledgedly uh like I think that this show has way more a lot to tell than it actually is. I think recently my ideas of what's going to happen at the very end of this are reasonably probably just like, oh no, like none of that all is happening, and we're just gonna get plop this because ultimately it's just a show. Ultimately, if it was a movie, like I could probably go into like Avengers Endgame and just be way overblown and way overshot and just be like, no, like man, like I was thinking like such a small thing, but man, did they like wow, man, did they like really like overshoot like anywhere possible what I thought was going on. But for a show, that's a little different. Like ultimately, you could probably figure everything out within the first pilot episode, and like recently, you could already like tell a lot of people are already figuring it all out, Easter eggs and whichever one have you, and ultimately they're gonna all decipher everything and before the show even ends, just be like, yeah, I knew it, I called it. So I think with that, I'm gonna call my way out of here. Yeah, there just really isn't a lot to dissect or even talk about in these episodes because there's only one main thing going on, and everything else is just a lot of this going on that doesn't matter. It's a lot of just like, oh, I'm confused. Yes, I am confused. I don't know why I'm confused, but I'm so confused. I have no back history of my character. I don't know who I am. Ba 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 ba. Like at one point we have Vision who is um talking to all his friends, and like they're kind of telling jokes or whatever, but again, like all of that is just kind of like going way over my head because ultimately it's just I don't like none of it is just something I feel is important, sadly enough. um I just feel like a lot of it is just kind of like I don't care. I'm waiting for the Easter egg to happen. I'm waiting for that sweet, delicious Easter egg, and maybe around the time of February, we're gonna get even more Easter eggs to come onto the show. But I'm kind of curious how long this show is going to be. Is it going to be an 8 episode thing? Is it going to be 10? Is it going to be 12? If ultimately it's just going to be 8 episodes, I'm like, oh, okay, so if anything, like this won't take too long before I'm already just kind of just done with this show, and that'll be fine. Um, and ultimately, when looking at it, I'm worrying if they're going to keep the 30-minute thing. And if they do, Then I'm like, oh, okay, well, great. Well, yeah, well, then, like, if you only do 8 episodes and it's only 30 minutes long, but ultimately, if it is 30 minutes long, then maybe they're going to be doing like 12 or 24 or something like that of this. I don't know. Um, ultimately, I'm assuming if it's 30 minutes, then it'll probably be like 12 episodes, probably. So we probably have 10 more episodes to go. I don't know. When looking at it, but yeah, I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.